The story begins beneath a sky the color of iron. The prairie stretches endless and empty, its surface buried beneath fresh layers of snow. Wind screams across the open land, tearing at fence posts and rattling the bare branches that cling stubbornly to life. In that vast whiteness moves a single figure, small, fragile, and stumbling, her breath rising in desperate, uneven gasps. Her name is Clara Whitlow, and she has been walking for hours. Her threadbare dress clings to her legs, soaked through with melting snow. The once brown shawl around her shoulders is crusted white, frozen stiff. Each step is a battle against the wind that slices through cloth and skin alike. The sun has long since disappeared behind thick gray clouds, leaving only the dim light of late afternoon to guide her. Clara's journey began that morning when she was cast out of the wealthy Gresham household where she had worked for almost a year. She had taken the position as a maid after her parents' deaths, left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of recommendation that soon proved worthless. At first, the Greshams treated her as invisible, which she preferred to cruelty. But when a gold locket went missing, suspicion fell immediately upon the poor girl with no family, no friends, and no voice to defend herself. She had begged to be heard, trembling as Mrs. Gresham's cold eyes assessed her like a criminal. "You've always been too quiet," the woman said. "Quiet people hide things." Mr. Gresham, uninterested in the argument, merely opened the door and ordered her to leave. It didn't matter that the snow was already falling thick outside. The decision had been made. The locket would later be found beneath their daughter's pillow, but by then Clara would be long gone. Now, with the wind howling around her, she replays that moment again and again. The snap of the door shutting behind her, the sound of the latch sliding into place, the absolute silence afterward. Every step she takes feels like walking further into nothingness. Her boots, thin and cracked, are soaked through. Her toes burn, then go numb. The cold gnaws at her hands until she can no longer feel them. She tries to keep her thoughts steady, counting each breath, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. She thinks of her mother's voice telling her to be brave, to trust that good people still exist somewhere. But as the world fades into a blur of white, that hope begins to die. She spots, through the swirling snow, a faint outline, a fence line that marks the edge of someone's land. Relief flickers for a heartbeat. If she can follow it, maybe it will lead to a barn, a shed, any shelter at all. She grips one frozen post and drags herself forward, but her legs are heavy and clumsy. The wind shifts, knocking her off balance. She falls to her knees, snow filling the folds of her skirt. For a long moment she kneels there, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. Tears freeze on her lashes before they can fall. She forces herself up once, then again, but the strength drains out of her body as quickly as it comes. When she finally collapses, she doesn't rise. The cold is no longer painful now, it's gentle, almost kind. She feels strangely light, her thoughts drifting toward warmth that isn't there. In her half-dream, she imagines a voice, a man's voice, calling out through the storm, deep and steady. She can tell if it is real, or only her fading mind trying to comfort her. The snow keeps falling, covering her small body inch by inch, until she is almost invisible against the endless white. The world grows silent except for the wind, and for a time it seems the prairie itself has swallowed her. But far off, beyond the next ridge, a horse's hooves break the stillness. A lantern swings in the darkness, and the man holding it reins his horse to a halt, sensing something ahead. Fate, at last, has begun to turn. The snow had already reached the fence rails when Elias Turner saddled his horse. Most men in the valley had long since shuttered their doors and banked their fires, but Elias was not most men. A storm never frightened him. The land was all he had left, and the animals under his care depended on him to weather every hardship, just as he had since his wife, Annie, passed 3 winters ago. The lantern light flickered across the walls of his modest barn as he tightened the girth strap around his chestnut gelding, Rusty. The old horse stamped impatiently, steam curling from his nostrils. "Easy now," Elias murmured, pulling on his gloves. "Just a quick ride. We'll bring the calf in and be home before the worst hits." The missing calf had wandered off during the afternoon feeding, likely frightened by the growing wind. In these temperatures, the little creature wouldn't last the night. Elias couldn't stand the thought of another life lost to the cold, not after all he'd already buried. The gate creaked as he led Rusty out into the storm. Snow slanted across the open land like a curtain of white fire. The wind bit at his face, and the world narrowed to the small circle of light cast by his lantern. He guided the horse toward the lower pasture, his mind half on the calf, half on the eerie stillness that came before the heaviest part of a blizzard. Elias was a man of few words, fewer friends, and deep habits. Since Annie's death, he had lived by a quiet rhythm. Rise before dawn, tend the herdmen fences, share supper with Martha, the elderly housekeeper who had once cared for Annie during her illness, and then read a passage from the worn Bible by the fire before bed. It was a life of silence and duty, and though loneliness pressed in sometimes like the cold, he had learned to bear it without complaint. Tonight, though, something felt different. The land seemed restless, uneasy. Even the wind had a strange tone to it, as if carrying a cry he couldn't quite hear. Half a mile from the barn, Elias slowed his horse near a cluster of rocks and broken fence posts. The lantern light flickered over drifts of snow and the faint marks of small hooves, but something else caught his eye. A shape, small, dark, motionless. He reined in sharply, heart thudding. "Whoa, Rusty!" The horse halted, snorting at the wind. Elias swung down, boots sinking deep into the snow. At first, he thought it might be a fallen deer, or maybe the calf, frozen where it stood. But as he drew closer, his breath caught. It was a person. He dropped to his knees beside the figure, brushing snow away with his gloved hands until a pale face emerged. Young, delicate, rimmed with frost. Her lips were blue, her lashes crusted white. For a moment, he feared he was too late. But then, faintly, he saw her chest rise. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, yanking off one glove and pressing his fingers to her neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. He wasted no time. Lifting her gently, he wrapped his heavy coat around her trembling body and carried her to his horse. She was light, too light, as though the cold had hollowed her out. "Hold on, miss," he said, his voice low but firm. "You hear me? You hold on." Her head lolled against his shoulder, a soft sound escaping her lips, something like a sigh, maybe a word. He couldn't tell. Elias settled her in front of him on the saddle, one arm wrapped around her to keep her upright. As they turned toward home, the wind howled louder, driving sheets of snow into their faces. Rusty fought forward step by step, hooves crunching through the frozen drifts. Elias bent close to the girl, whispering against her ear, "You're safe now." She didn't answer, but he felt her weakly clutch at the edge of his coat, an instinct, a plea to live. And so he urged the horse onward through the storm, toward the faint flickering light of his cabin. Somewhere behind them the snow fell heavier, erasing all trace of where she had lain, as if fate itself had chosen that she be found, and that this night, of all nights, would bind two lost souls together. By the time Elias Turner reached his ranch, the storm had swallowed the world whole. The lantern's flame had died miles back, leaving only the dim outline of his cabin's roofline flickering through the snow. The wind clawed at his coat, threatening to tear the unconscious girl from his grasp, but Elias held her tighter, one arm wrapped protectively around her slight frame. "Just a little farther, miss," he murmured, though she could not hear him. Her head rested limply against his shoulder, her breath shallow and quick. Her hair, damp with melted snow, clung to his glove. Every few moments, he leaned down to check her breathing, each faint rise of her chest a fragile victory. When the horse finally stumbled up to the porch, Elias swung down and lifted the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and frozen cloth. The door burst open as he kicked it, and the warm glow of the hearth spilled out into the blizzard. Inside, Martha, his gray-haired housekeeper, gasped when she saw them. "Sweet Lord, Elias, what on earth—" "No time," he cut in, his voice rough. "Blankets, hot water, now." Martha didn't ask another question. Years of working beside him had taught her to recognize urgency in his tone. She hurried to the stove, setting a kettle over the fire while Elias carried the girl to the old settee near the hearth. The flames glowed gold against her pale face, revealing how close she'd come to death. Her lips were colorless, her lashes rimmed with frost, and her fingertips, small, delicate things, were a dangerous shade of blue. Elias stripped off his coat, wrapping her in thick wool blankets from the chair. He rubbed her hands gently, trying to stir warmth back into them. "Come on now," he muttered softly, half to her, half to himself. "You're not leaving this world tonight." Martha returned with steaming cloths and a bowl of water. Together they worked in silence, thawing the ice that had settled into her hair and cleaning the small cuts along her cheeks. The fire snapped and hissed, fighting the cold that seemed to cling to the girl's very skin. After a long while, Martha poured a bit of broth into a spoon and touched it to the girl's lips. At first, nothing happened. Then a small sound escaped her throat, a weak attempt to swallow. Elias felt his chest tighten. "That's it," he whispered, relief washing through him like warmth after frost. "That's it, you're safe now." The words slipped out before he realized he'd spoken them. Martha glanced at him, her eyes softening. It had been a long time since Elias had spoken to anyone in that tone, a voice gentled by care, not duty. The hours passed slowly. The storm outside howled like a living beast, but inside the cabin the light glowed steady and warm. Elias sat by the girl's side, refusing to rest. Every few minutes he checked her pulse, his rough hand hovering near her wrist. When her breathing grew stronger, he finally leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing down, but not enough to make him move away. "Who do you reckon she is?" Martha asked quietly, setting down the empty bowl. Elias shook his head. "Don't know. But no one deserves to die out there like that." He looked at her face again, so young, so fragile, and felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of recognition. He knew what it meant to be left in the cold. When dawn finally broke, the snow outside lay deep and still. The girl slept peacefully for the first time, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Elias rose, feeding more wood into the fire. As the flames caught and brightened, he said quietly, almost to himself, "You made it, miss. You're safe now." And though she didn't wake, a faint smile touched her lips, like a promise that she'd heard him after all. The storm raged through the night, hammering against the ranch walls, like a living thing determined to reclaim what Elias had rescued. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, casting long orange shadows over the small cabin. Clara, the girl from the snow, lay still beneath layers of blankets, her fragile breaths rising and falling with the uncertain rhythm of someone trapped between life and death. Elias had not slept. His coat still hung damp by the fire, but he barely noticed. Every so often he leaned forward, his hand hovering near Clara's cheek or wrist, checking for warmth, for life. Martha, his steadfast housekeeper, moved quietly around the room, refilling the kettle, wringing out cloths, whispering small prayers under her breath. "Her fever's trying to rise," Martha said softly, pressing the back of her hand to the girl's forehead. "We got her warm too fast. The body fights when it's been that cold for too long. Elias frowned, worry creasing the lines around his eyes. Then what do we do? Slowly, steady, Martha replied. Keep her drinking, keep her breathing. And so, through the long hours of that night, the two of them fought for a stranger's life. Elias fetched more wood, built the fire higher, and sat by the girl's side as Martha spooned thin broth between her pale lips. Sometimes Clara stirred, a tremor in her fingers, a soft murmur that neither of them could understand. But mostly she lay silent, her face too still, her lashes dark against her cheeks. Elias found himself speaking to her even when she could not hear. "You hold on now," he murmured. "There's warmth here, food, a roof over your head. You're not alone anymore." His voice, gravelly and low, filled the small cabin like a quiet promise. Outside, the wind screamed down from the hills, rattling the windows. But inside, there was only the steady crackle of the fire and the sound of two souls refusing to give up on another. By midnight, Martha forced Elias to eat a little and rest his back against the wall. "You'll be no use to her if you fall over dead," she scolded. He gave a weary half-smile. "You sound like Annie used to." At the mention of his late wife, Martha's face softened. "She'd be proud you still got some fight left in you." Elias didn't answer. He only looked at the girl again. Something in her fragility called to the quiet, buried part of him, the part that still believed goodness hadn't completely gone from the world. Hours crept by. The storm began to ease, the wind softening to a mournful whistle through the eaves. Just before dawn, Martha dozed off in her chair, and Elias kept watch alone. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered another prayer, not for himself but for the stranger who had stumbled into his life. As the first gray light of morning touched the window, Clara stirred. It was the faintest movement, a twitch of her hand, then a soft sound, something between a sigh and a word. Elias straightened instantly. "Easy now," he said, voice low, steady. "You're safe. You're all right." Her eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, clear, lost, and glassy with confusion. Then they closed again, but her breathing steadied. The fever that had threatened to take her broke quietly, leaving a damp sheen of sweat on her forehead. Martha woke with a start and hurried over, pressing her hand to the girl's cheek. "She's warm," she whispered. "Properly warm this time." Elias let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sat back, rubbing his eyes, and finally allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Then she'll make it," he said simply. The snow outside glittered in the early light, clean and untouched, as though the world itself had been remade overnight. Inside the cabin, the battle was won, not by luck, but by stubborn, quiet care. And though Clara slept on, unaware, Elias looked at her one last time and thought, "You came back from the cold. You're safe now." When Clara Whitlow awoke, the world was still and unfamiliar. The air smelled of smoke and pine, the kind of warmth that felt almost unreal after so much cold. For a long moment she didn't move. She only listened. There was the crackle of fire somewhere nearby, the gentle creak of wood as the cabin breathed in the morning air, and beneath it all, a silence that was neither cruel nor empty, but peaceful. Her eyelids felt heavy. The last thing she remembered was snow, white, endless, merciless. She had fallen, the world had gone quiet, and she had thought it was the end. Now the sharp ache in her chest told her it wasn't. She tried to sit up but gasped at the pain that shot through her limbs. The blankets around her were thick and soft, far too fine for a girl like her. A wooden table stood nearby, its surface cluttered with a lantern, a tin cup, and a folded cloth. The cabin was small but tidy, its walls lined with shelves and tools, a rifle hanging above the door. Then she saw him. A man sat a few feet away in a worn chair by the hearth. His head was bowed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely together. He looked as though he'd been sitting there for hours, watching, waiting. The firelight caught on his unshaven jaw and the edges of his weathered coat. Clara's breath hitched. She didn't know where she was or who he was. Instinct screamed that she had to leave, but when she tried to move again, her body betrayed her. A small sound escaped her throat. The man lifted his head immediately. His eyes, gray, steady, and kind in a rough sort of way, met hers. "You're awake," he said softly. His voice carried the low, gravelly weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "Easy now. Don't try to move too fast." Clara pressed back into the pillow, panic flickering in her chest. "Why, where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "My ranch," he answered. "You were half frozen out there when I found you. I brought you in." She blinked, trying to make sense of it. You saved me?" He gave a small shrug, as if it were nothing. "Couldn't just leave you to the snow." The simplicity of his words unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Kindness was something she no longer knew how to trust. She swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the door. "I don't have anything to give you. No money, no family." His brow furrowed. "No one's asking for that." But she shook her head stubbornly, fear thick in her throat. "People don't help for nothing. They never do." For a moment, he didn't speak. The fire popped, filling the silence. Then he said quietly, "Maybe they should." His name, she learned soon after, was Elias Turner. The older woman who appeared with a cup of steaming broth was Martha, his housekeeper. Martha's voice carried no judgment, only brisk care as she said, "Drink this, dear. You've got strength to build back." Clara hesitated but obeyed, her hands trembling as she lifted the spoon. The warmth of the broth spread through her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. "You're safe here," Martha said gently. Safe. The word felt strange, almost foreign. Clara wanted to believe it, but her heart couldn't yet. She'd trusted before, trusted people who smiled while they ruined her. Still, something about the quiet steadiness in Elias's gaze made her think that maybe, just maybe, this was different. When exhaustion pulled her back into sleep, Elias rose and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. For a man of few words, he moved with a surprising tenderness, careful not to wake her. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world was bright again. The storm passed. But inside that small cabin, something else had begun. A fragile sense of safety, the first flicker of trust thawing in a heart that had long forgotten warmth. And though Clara didn't hear him, Elias whispered once more, almost as a vow to the quiet morning air, "You're safe now." Days passed slowly in the Turner ranch house, the kind of quiet days that carried both peace and tension. Outside, the world remained blanketed in snow, the sky wide and mercilessly pale. Inside, the fire burned steady, its warmth filling the cabin with a fragile sense of safety. Clara Whitlow was healing, physically at least. Her cheeks had begun to regain color, and her hands no longer trembled when she held a cup. But though her body mended, her spirit remained wary, guarded behind soft smiles and silence. Elias Turner noticed it, though he never said a word. He was a man who understood silence better than most. His own life had been shaped by things unspoken, the wife he'd lost, the loneliness he never named, the empty chair at supper he never filled. So he didn't pry. He simply offered steady kindness, a meal, a blanket, quiet company by the fire. Clara, however, lived each moment as though she stood on the edge of discovery. She knew this safety could vanish at any second, as it always had before. Each night before she slept, she folded her few belongings, her torn shawl, the broken comb she carried in her pocket, so that if she were told to leave in the morning, she could go quickly. Martha, kind as she was, seemed to sense this too. "You're jumpy as a rabbit, dear," she said one afternoon, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. "You're among good folk now." Clara offered a small, nervous smile. "I know. I'm just not used to it." But the truth ran deeper. Every time Elias entered the room, every time his boots creaked on the wooden floor, a flicker of unease moved through her. He wasn't unkind, far from it, but she'd learned that men with quiet voices could still carry cruelty behind calm eyes. She'd seen it before. She remembered the Greshams, the wealthy family who had taken her in when her parents died. They'd promised her honest work and food to eat. Instead, they'd given her long hours, sharp words, and blame for things she hadn't done. When Mrs. Gresham's gold locket went missing, it was Clara they accused. "Poor girls with no family have nothing to lose," Mrs. Gresham had sneered. "You probably thought no one would notice." No one had listened when she swore her innocence. They'd have thrown her out into the snow with only her shawl and a single loaf of bread. She had walked until her strength failed. That was all she remembered before waking in Elias's home. Now, each time Martha or Elias showed her kindness, guilt twisted inside her. She didn't belong here. She didn't deserve their care. And if they found out about the accusations, if they learned she was branded a thief, surely they would send her away too. Still, something in Elias's quiet presence began to soften the walls she'd built. He didn't ask questions. When he spoke, it was with gentle certainty. "You should rest more," he told her one evening as she tried to wash dishes with still shaking hands. "I can work," she replied quickly. "I don't want to be a burden." His gray eyes met hers. "You're not." The simplicity of his words disarmed her more than pity ever could. She turned away, blinking back tears she didn't want him to see. Later that night, as the wind sighed outside the cabin, Clara sat awake by the window, staring at the stars through the frost-blurred glass. A life like this, quiet, safe, filled with warmth, felt like something borrowed, too fragile to last. She whispered into the darkness, "Don't let them find me." Elias, half awake by the hearth, heard the faint sound but didn't stir. He only added another log to the fire, its glow deepening the light that filled the small room. Neither of them knew it yet, but the past Clara tried so desperately to hide would not stay buried for long. The world beyond those snow-covered hills had already begun to whisper her name again. Winter held the Turner Ranch in a quiet grip, the kind of stillness that made time move slower and softer. Days blended together, gray skies, white fields, the faint sound of wind whispering through the barn rafters. For Clara Whitlow, those weeks became a strange, healing dream. She had expected to be cast out once she could walk again, but instead, Elias Turner simply told her, "Stay until you're ready." And somehow those simple words stretched from one day to the next until the snow itself seemed reluctant to melt. Clara began helping with small chores. At first, Martha kept her near the warmth of the house, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, mending old curtains. But as her strength returned, she ventured outside. The first time she stepped into the biting air, Elias was there, hitching a sled to his horse. "You sure you're up for it?" he asked, his tone half teasing, half concerned. She lifted her chin. "I've worked through worse." That made him smile, a rare thing that softened the rugged lines of his face. "Then come on. We'll take it slow." That morning, she learned to move with the rhythm of ranch life, the creak of the barn door, the puff of the horse's breath, the crunch of frozen hay beneath her boots. The air was sharp, but for the first time it didn't feel like an enemy. The cold became a companion, something to work against, not flee from. Elias showed her how to feed the horses, how to clear ice from the troughs, how to patch a fence with her own two hands. He spoke little, But when he did, his words carried a calm steadiness that wrapped around her like wool. "You don't have to rush things," he said one day as she struggled with a bale of hay. "The world moves fast enough without our help." She gave him a small, shy smile. "You sound like someone who's done a lot of waiting." "I have," he replied, eyes distant. "But waiting teaches you what's worth keeping." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window looking at the stars spilling across the black sky. For the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of belonging, not from obligation or fear, but from quiet acceptance. She wasn't just surviving, she was living. As the days went on, an unspoken bond grew between them. Elias didn't pry into her past, and Clara didn't ask about the framed photograph that sat by the hearth, a woman with gentle eyes and a little boy in her arms. She sensed loss in the way Elias sometimes stared into the fire too long, in the way his voice softened when he said the name Annie. And though she never spoke of the cruelty she'd endured, he seemed to understand it without needing to hear the words. Their connection was built on silence, the kind of silence that comforts instead of stings. Some evenings they would sit across from each other while Martha knitted nearby. Elias would carve small wooden figures, horses, birds, stars, and hand them to Clara without explanation. She kept them on the windowsill, small tokens of something wordless and kind. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Clara said quietly, "No one ever came for me before?" Elias looked up from the fire. "You didn't need saving, Clara. You just needed a place to start again." The words lingered between them, soft and certain. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside, there was only the sound of the crackling fire and the steady beat of two hearts that had finally found peace in each other's presence. That winter, the ranch became more than shelter for Clara. It became the beginning of something sacred, and for Elias, it was the first time in years that laughter returned to the walls of his home. In the stillness of that frozen season, two broken lives began to thaw, slowly, gently, like the first touch of spring beneath the snow. By the time the snow began to melt from the fence posts, the Turner Ranch had changed. What once felt cold and silent now echoed faintly with laughter. Martha's gentle humming, Elias's low chuckle when Clara teased him about his gruffness, even the soft tapping of her boots as she went about morning chores. It was quiet joy, the kind that sneaks up when hearts have learned to stop fearing peace. But the world beyond those snow-locked hills hadn't forgotten Clara Whitlow. The first sign came one gray afternoon when a rider appeared at the edge of the valley. Elias was chopping wood near the barn when he spotted the man, a dark figure against the melting snow, a plume of dust rising behind him. Something in the stranger's posture, too straight, too practiced, made Elias's instincts tighten. When the man reached the porch, Clara happened to be sweeping. She froze, her hand gripping the broom as if it were a weapon. Her face went pale. Elias saw the look and knew immediately. This was no friendly caller. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth, a little too polite. "Name's Mr. Hollis. I'm looking for a girl. About yay tall, brown hair, quiet sort. Worked for the Greshams back east." Elias's jaw tightened. "Can't help you there," he replied, his tone flat. Mr. Hollis glanced past him, eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Clara standing in the doorway. His smile sharpened. "Well now, ain't that something?" "Miss Whitlow? Fancy seeing you alive." Clara's breath caught. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. "Don't—" But Hollis didn't stop. "You left quite a mess behind, girl. Mrs. Gresham swore you'd stolen her locket before you ran off. Been looking to set that record straight. Some folks might even call that theft." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between them. "You best leave." Hollis's eyes flickered with amusement. You her protector now, rancher? Careful. Harboring a thief could make you one, too. The silence that followed was heavy as a storm. Elias didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for the rifle leaning by the porch post. He didn't need to. The steadiness in his stance spoke louder than any threat. Get off my land, he said. For a long moment, Hollis studied him, then tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Fine, but I'll be back. The law's got a way of catching up, even out here. He rode off, leaving the air behind him cold and raw. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Clara sank to her knees. Her breath came in shallow gasps. He knows where I am now, she murmured. They'll come. They'll say things, and you'll believe them. Elias crouched beside her, his voice low. I don't care what they say. Tears filled her eyes. You don't understand. They hate me because I spoke the truth. Mrs. Gresham's son, She stopped, shaking her head. They'll twist it. They'll make it sound like I did wrong. He didn't press her to finish. Instead, he simply rested a hand on her shoulder. You're safe here, Clara. As long as I'm breathing, no one's taking you anywhere. But that night, long after the lamps were out, Elias sat awake by the fire, thinking. He knew men like Hollis, paid messengers, manipulators who thrived on others' pain. If they were hunting her this far west, it meant someone powerful wanted her found. Outside, the snow melted into slow, muddy streams, carrying winter away with it. Inside, the warmth of the hearth felt thinner than before, stretched against the chill of what was coming. For the first time since she arrived, Clara wished she'd never been found in that snow. Because the life she'd begun to build, the fragile peace she'd found in Elias as quiet strength, now stood on the edge of ruin. And she knew the next storm wouldn't come from the sky. It would come on horseback, wearing the faces of those who'd left her to die. The days that followed Mr. Hollis's visit felt different, quieter, heavier. The laughter that once filled the Turner Ranch had dimmed into whispers. Even the wind outside seemed to move slower, as though holding its breath. Clara tried to go about her chores, but her hands trembled every time she looked toward the ridge where Hollis had appeared. Fear settled into her like frost, silent, invisible, but bone deep. She had known peace here, fleeting, but real. Now it was slipping through her fingers like snow. Elias noticed. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she startled at every sound, but he said nothing at first. He gave her space, hoping his quiet presence would be enough. Yet inside, he wrestled with anger, the cold, hard kind that comes when a man sees someone good being hunted for sins that aren't theirs. 3 nights later, the storm came. It began with the wind howling through the valley, fierce and relentless. Clouds rolled over the mountains like a dark tide. By nightfall, the snow returned, thick and blinding, erasing the world in white. Martha bolted the shutters while Elias checked the horses, his lantern flickering against the gale. Inside, Clara sat by the fire, clutching the small wooden bird Elias had carved for her weeks ago. The flames wavered, shadows twisting across the walls. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Only one thought echoed in her mind. They'll find me. When Elias came back in, snow coating his coat and hat, she turned toward him, pale and trembling. Elias, she whispered, if they come, if they bring the sheriff, don't fight them. Please. I won't let anyone get hurt because of me. He set down the lantern, his expression unreadable. You think I'd let them take you out there? Not a chance. Tears filled her eyes. You don't understand. They'll twist it just like before. They'll say I stole. They'll say I lied. He stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Then we tell the truth. Clara shook her head violently. The truth never mattered to them. Lightning flashed outside, followed by the deep crack of thunder. The storm roared like an animal. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the fire crackled, small and fragile against the wind. Finally, Clara broke. Her voice cracked like glass. Mrs. Gresham's son tried to force himself on me. I fought him off, scratched his face, and she said I tempted him. That's why they threw me out. That's why they called me a thief, because they needed me gone. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Elias didn't move at first. His eyes darkened, not with judgment, but with fury that burned slow and deep. "They left you in the snow for that?" he asked quietly. She nodded, trembling. "And now, they'll say whatever they must to finish it." He took a step forward and knelt beside her, the firelight drawing hard shadows across his face. "Listen to me, Clara. You're not the one who should be ashamed. They are. You did nothing wrong." Her tears fell freely then, hot and unstoppable. Outside, the storm raged louder, shaking the windows. But inside the cabin, something softer broke open between them. At last, Elias stood and threw another log into the fire. "Whatever comes, we face it together," he said. "You're not running anymore." Clara looked up at him through her tears. For the first time, she believed him. The wind howled, snow beating against the shutters like fists. But in that moment, the storm outside no longer scared her as much as the one inside her, the one that was finally, mercifully beginning to calm. Because now, she wasn't alone. By morning, the storm had broken. The world outside was unrecognizable. White hills gleaming under a pale sun, the air crisp and still after the long night's fury. The Turner Ranch stood quiet but unbroken, smoke curling from its chimney into the cold blue sky. Inside, the fire burned low, its embers pulsing softly in the hearth. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the steady sound of Elias moving about the room. For the first time in months, she had slept deeply, her dreams free from the shadows of her past. But when she rose and looked out the frost-blurred window, a flicker of fear returned. Hoof prints, several sets, half buried in snow, leading up to the barn. She drew a sharp breath. "Elias," she whispered. He was already at the door, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he said quietly, though his voice held no panic, only readiness. Moments later, 3 men rode into view. Mr. Hollis was among them, flanked by 2 lawmen, their badges catching the morning light. They dismounted slowly, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as she stood behind the curtain, watching. Elias stepped out onto the porch, coat collar high against the cold. "Morning," he called. Hollis tipped his hat with mock civility. "Told you I'd be back, Turner. This here's Sheriff Grady. We've got business with a Miss Clara Whitlow." The sheriff was a tall man with tired eyes. He held a folded paper in his gloved hand. "Got a warrant here says she's wanted for theft, signed by the Gresham family." Elias didn't flinch. "And I say they're liars." The sheriff hesitated. Hollis frowned. "You're protecting a criminal," he said. "Hand her over before this gets ugly." At that moment, Clara stepped outside. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "No," she said softly. "I won't hide any more." The men turned toward her. Elias started to protest, but she met his eyes and shook her head. "It's time." She faced the sheriff directly. "They accused me because I spoke the truth. Mrs. Gresham's son tried to force himself on me. When I fought back, they said I stole from them to cover the shame. But I never touched that locket. I swear it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the wind moved, stirring loose snow from the fence posts. The sheriff studied her, his brow furrowing. "Mr. Hollis, you didn't mention that part." Hollis scoffed. Because it's nonsense. The girl's desperate, making up stories to save her hide. But Elias stepped forward, his voice low and unwavering. You can see for yourself she's telling the truth. I've seen enough liars in my life to know the difference. The sheriff looked between them, weighing the calm certainty in Elias's tone against the slick confidence of Hollis's. At last he sighed. I'll take this back east and ask a few questions. Until then, no one's arresting anybody. Hollis's face twisted with anger. You'll regret this, Sheriff. The Greshams won't. Let them write me a letter, the sheriff interrupted. Then, turning to Clara, he added gently, Stay put. You're safe for now. When they rode off, silence fell again. Soft, heavy, almost holy. Clara's knees gave out, and Elias caught her before she hit the snow. It's over, he murmured. No, she whispered through tears. It's beginning. He smiled faintly. Then we start together. Weeks passed. The snow melted, revealing green shoots and thawing streams. Spring came to the Turner Ranch, carrying warmth back into the world. Clara worked the garden beside Martha, her laughter ringing clear again. The shadows of her past no longer followed her. They had dissolved into the soil of this new life. Sometimes at sunset, Elias would find her standing at the fence, gazing at the open horizon. He would walk up beside her, silent, steady, the same way he had the night he found her half frozen in the snow. And every time, as the sky turned gold, she would whisper the words he once said to her, the words that had changed everything. You're safe now. And at last, she truly was.